Hello and thanks for joining me for this video. We're in Ecclesall Woods today and I'm looking at some raspberries which are now ripe. So these raspberries have been in flower since the end of June and they're now producing relatively ripe fruit. And this is because we're in quite a bright area here, so a little bit further along the path where there are raspberries and blackberries, they are not fruit, they have not come into either come into flower or they have not produced fruit in the same way yet, simply because it's just not light enough. So this is a little patch in Ecclesall Woods where there was once a big tree and now there's a big hole in the canopy, and that's why we've got enough light here. So this is a raspberry and we can tell because it's got the lighter green foliage. It's a slightly more yellowish green if we look, and the foliage is slightly more delicate than if we look along the path a little bit further here. We can see some blackberry or some bramble, and it's a little bit hard to get your eye in, but the foliage generally is a little bit darker and it's certainly coarser, particularly if it's the older foliage, which is last year's foliage, so this will have survived from last winter. So needless to say, the blackberries take a little bit longer, so they're barely flowering in certain places. So we've got little white flowers here, some of which have gone over, so these will produce fruit probably late July going into August. But we've got a nice local variant here. So most blackberry flowers are white, but this is a natural variation as well, so look out for these pink flowers. Oh, and we've got a bee as well, how lovely. You'd be forgiven for thinking I'm stood underneath a beech tree here. It has a lot of the qualities of a beech tree because the shade here is quite dense, and there's a lot of beech trees in Ecclesall Woods, although, having said that, they were brought into this area because beech is not native to this part of the British Isles. It's actually a tree from southern England. This is actually a hornbeam, Carpinus speculus, and we can tell it apart principally because of this bark, which is really, really characteristic. It's almost striated, it's got a vertical twisting braided pattern in it, and it's generally relatively smooth like the beech tree it so closely resembles, but it's just a little bit flaky, this one, because it's a bit older. So also, like the beech, it comes from the south of England and there's not that many in these woods, so it's quite special. If we look at the leaves themselves, again very beech-like, except for the fact that they have a much more serrated edge to them, whereas beech has a wavy edge. This has a very serrated or knife-like edge and a very distinctive point as well. Can you see that? So yeah, beech does not have that distinctive point. So look out for these in Ecclesall Woods because there's only a few, but on this particular path there's several. I think there's about 4 or 5 on this path, so it's quite a nice place to come to find them. This is a larch cone, so they're actually quite papery, so they might be slightly similar to the more recognisable pine cones, which are quite a woody type of cone, but this is quite papery. In fact, you can actually pull the scales back, which is one of the defining features of this, and it was landed here on this big root, which is really scaly. This is the typical feature of larix. It has these quite exposed root systems. This is actually not native to this woodland, but if we look over here, that doesn't stop it being eaten. So there's various the half-eaten ones here, and I expect this is the work of a squirrel, but it could possibly be another mammal, or maybe even a bird. It's hard to say, but I suspect squirrel, and it'll be grey squirrel obviously in these woods. The plant we're looking at here is Enchanter's nightshade, and I can't speak to whether it's enchanted or not, but it's definitely not a nightshade. It's not in the same family. It's actually in the family to which willow herbs also belong. Those tall pink flowered herbs are very common. This is the kind of plant that you might tend to look past quite easily. You could walk past it and not even notice it's there because the flowers are so very small. But it is actually a very common woodland species, and it's in flower from June onwards, sometimes through till August. And it's got a bit of a bad reputation because when it gets into your garden, unfortunately it tends to become a little bit weedy, and that's because it has overwintering rhizomes, so it doesn't die back very much for what is essentially a deciduous plant, so it does have a bit of a competitive advantage over other plant species in the garden, but a nice thing to find in the woods nonetheless. Here we're looking at a Scots pine, and as the name suggests, it's actually more frequent the further north you go. It's actually at the bottom of its native range in this part of the Pennines, so it's not a frequent tree around here, although it does occur here naturally just about. So the fact that it's in these woodlands would suggest it's been introduced here because it's not a locally common species, and that it was probably introduced along with some other conifers for its timber value, but it's the only native conifer of its type that's been introduced to the woods, because we have other species here like larch and Douglas fir which aren't native to this country and were imported from elsewhere. We know we're looking at a pine tree because of this absolutely gorgeous bark. It's really red and it's got some really nice tones within it, some really sort of peachy grey coloured tones within it. It's very textured, and as you'll notice as I'm touching it, it's actually quite flaky. Not that I encourage people to start picking the barks off trees, because that's just not done. But what's particularly special about this tree is it's actually quite old. This one I think measures about 2.2 metres around the girth, so it makes it fairly old. It's probably one of the older pines to be introduced into these woods. It's probably around about 200 years old, somewhere around about there. And if we look right up the top of the tree, we can find a good view up there. Can you see that it's actually got what I describe as elbows? It's got arms that are sort of resting outwards and then reaching up. So this is something that Scots pines do that other conifers don't tend to do. Conifers grow very differently from broadleaf trees, but this one, effectively, it's got to a certain height and a certain age, and instead of just going up and having branches around the trunk, like most conifers, it started to pretend like it's a broadleaf tree and it's actually reaching out sideways. So this gives another indication that this is a relatively old tree, because this is something they tend to do once they get to a little bit more of an advanced age. This is our native honeysuckle, which is Lonicera periclymenum, and we can tell this is the native form because it's got a narrower leaf. The cultivated form has a broader leaf, it's more rounded. So this is the one you would expect and hope to find in woodlands, because this is the one that supports all the wildlife. So it has very long tubular flowers, which gives you an indication of what type of insect tends to pollinate this, and it's very much visited by moths. In fact, it has a beautiful smell at night time, which really attracts them in. It's a particular favourite of the elephant hawk moth and other hawk moths, but also it has its own specific moth species associated with it, such as the honeysuckle moth, which is actually its larvae. The caterpillars feed on this plant. So it's a really important summer flower, because at this point in the year many of the spring plants have gone over, because obviously we're now in July, so there's a lot less in flower in the woods, so this is a very important food source for many species. And again, we're in a fairly bright area here, and this is why it's flowering relatively well, because although there's an awful lot of honeysuckle within Ecclesall Woods, not all of it flowers as well as this. It really does depend on how much light it gets. Here I am standing underneath a rowan tree, or Sorbus aucuparia, and this is what I describe as a medium-sized tree. It never gets particularly tall, but in a woodland context they can end up quite spindly like this, which is one of the reasons it's actually quite difficult to show you the foliage on this tree, because it's actually quite a long way above my head. So let's have a look at the bark. It's not a particularly distinctive bark in the sense that it's silvery, yes, it's got a bit of algae on it with this, and also some lichen, because it's something that happens with age, but it's a silvery colour, but it's not bright white like a silver birch, and it doesn't tend to have a very strong texture or pattern to it, so as it ages it doesn't really change a vast amount. Sometimes when the sun hits them they look very reflective, they have almost like a luminescent shine to them, so this is something to look out for. And they're not a particularly abundant tree in the woodland, so they tend to stand out particularly when the sun's shining on them because of that reason. So I can't show you the leaves on this particular tree, but I can show you some of its offspring, of which there are quite a few just down here. Careful not to step on them. So here we go. Here's one of the saplings that's been produced from the parent tree, and this is why you can see that it's actually called a mountain ash, because the leaves very strongly do resemble the compound or pinnate leaf of a ash tree, and this is a leaf that's composed out of leaflets. So each of these is a leaflet, and together they make one leaf. But what makes this distinctive is that the overall leaf is actually much smaller than an ash tree, which can be several times bigger than this. And also it has a very distinctive serration on the edge of each leaf, so that knife-like edge. Again, so that's a good identifying characteristic. The other thing that you might see a little bit later in the summer, or you would hopefully see, is lots of red berries. So round about August onwards, I would expect to see plenty of berries hanging down from the tree, and that's when they're red and they're ripe, that's when the birds tend to go for them.